Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with the extremely talented author of a really fun and insightful and just really engaging new fantasy. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. I am Daniel M. Ford. I am the author of most recently The Warden, which just came out on April 18th, which is a book about supporting your local necromancer, I guess.
It is so much fun. It's has a really great main character who has a really great perspective, and there are so many fun side characters. Before we get into the book itself too much, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to fantasy and to writing fantasy. I saw on your website that you have had a lifelong fascination with The Hobbit, which you encountered before. So wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you went from a fantasy fan to a creator.
I guess I kind of always wanted to tell fantasy stories, like since my dad read me The Hobbit when I was 4. And I read everything that I could find in the library. I read everything that I could find in a bookstore. I played any kind of computer game that had like swords in it. And I guess I first started writing, the first novel I tried to write was like fan fiction for a video game when I was 11 years old. I started writing a novel about my characters in a game called Knights of Legend that I think I'm one of like 6 people that remember even existed in 1989. And then I guess somewhere along the line, I got sidetracked into poetry and went and got several degrees in writing that. And then I kind of decided to see, I always wanted to be a fantasist. Like, I think that's who I am. So let's see if I can do it for real. And got really dedicated in like 2011. I mean, I'd always like dabbled and done a lot of world building, but finally I was like, you know what? I'm just going to start writing a story. I'm not going to worry about building the world or planning or anything. And that turned into the Paladin trilogy, which was my first 3 published books. And then it was kind of an always wanted to do it. And then in my early 30s, it was just like, either I'm going to do it now or I'm not gonna, right? Kind of a fish or go home moment. And I haven't stopped since then.
Awesome. Yeah, it's so much fun, and it feels like at once it feels really informed by like the tradition of fantasy that we have, but also it updates it in some really fun ways, I think.
Cool.
I would love to talk a little bit about well, first let's talk about the main character.
Okay.
She's so fantastic, and she finds herself in this like really kind of not ideal situation for her. Can you
No,
talk a little bit about where she finds herself at the start of
sure.
the book?
So Ailish, or Ailish Kairistiona de Lenti on Tirval is her full name, has just graduated from the Lyceum, which is like the magical college, and she's got degrees from 3 of the universities, which is a big deal. And she has undergone extra training to become a warden, which is like a wizard who is a guardian, judge, marshal, depending on where they're posted. And since she's a city girl, she's the daughter of a count, she just kind of expects she's going to get the plum posting like in a city. And instead, she gets sent 800 miles from anywhere to the forest primeval, as she calls it, a couple times. And she does not know how to deal with it. She doesn't know how to deal with goats or sheep. She's never been closer to one than like seeing it in the distance. She doesn't know really how people like this live their lives or what kind of help they need from her, right? All the problems she's trained to solve don't apply in this setting until they start to apply, right? Until she starts to figure out how to apply her training and her knowledge and her skills and her powers to help the people who are actually her responsibility.
Mm. Yeah, it's really fun to go on that journey with her. And I think that you do a great job of balancing in her character that she's like, kind of prickly. Like her and the townspeople don't get off on the best foot immediately. And that's kind of mutual, like they both kind of contribute to that.
Sure.
Like she's not, she's a little prickly and she doesn't get along with everybody, but she's also very compassionate and, and she does care about doing the right thing.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering, like, when you're crafting a character like that, how do you sort of, I guess, like, how do you balance there needing to be like conflict and stuff like that, and for characters to have flaws, but while still having them be like relatable or sort of somebody that you can kind of like empathize with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I with Ailish, she just felt very real. She still does feel very real to me. Like she feels like a person that I know. And I think I've been a high school teacher for like 15 years, and teaching in a college prep environment with like really highly motivated students who have, they anticipate a lot of success, and most of them are really successful, but some of them have to learn how to define success a little better. And
Mhm.
I think maybe my experience of teaching so many like really brilliant, motivated students who can seem arrogant a little bit, maybe sometimes. It's not a criticism of some of them. It's just they meet a lot of success at what they do, right? Whether that's in sports or school or whatever, and they expect that to keep happening, and it doesn't always, right? It doesn't always, and sometimes you have to learn to adjust. Like I said, your definition of what success means, and that's kind of what Ailish has to do. She takes the job of being a warden really seriously. She is from a noble family, but she does have that sort of idea of noble obligation to people. A lot is given to you. You have to give a lot back too. And I think it's just she doesn't know how to talk or relate to these people when she's not, Lady Delenti, when she's just the warden. She has to learn all over again how she can interact with people.
Mhm. I found her situation to be very empathetic from my end, because before I was in libraries, I was a medieval history PhD and I was going to go
Mm-hmm.
do the whole academia thing, and I just really felt a lot of kinship with her as somebody who was like super duper educated and like pretty smart and still not like, getting like the job that you want, or still feeling like stuck in your career. Um,
Sure.
were you commenting at all on sort of like academia, or like, the sort of like the fate of the adjunct, or
I mean,
you have a couple masters, right? So
yeah, maybe a little bit. I definitely did my fair share of adjuncting, and when I got my first master's, I thought I'm gonna get a PhD. It's gonna be great. And after 2 years of inside academia that way, I was so burnt out, and I applied to a bunch of English PhD programs. I was going to be a PhD in Irish literature, like in 20th century Irish poetry, and then I threw away all my letters from like my PhD programs without opening them. I didn't even want to know. Like I didn't even respond. A couple of them were calling me a lot in back in like April of 2003. So I think I probably got into a couple because they sure were trying to get hold of me. But I reached a point where I was like, I hate this. I don't want anything to do with this academia. I was totally burnt out. And then I went and got an MFA in creative writing, which is a terrible business, like a terrible career decision. But I became a better writer that way. My MFA is actually in poetry, not prose, so it's kind of a little strange that I've become a novelist then. Um, and did my fair share of adjuncting, and that was kind of right when the market shifted from you can get a full-time tenure track job with an MFA to now you need a PhD in creative writing, right? When I started it, the MFA was the terminal degree, and then suddenly it wasn't anymore. And by the time I finished that, I was just kind of done with school, and I'm like, well, I'll go teach high school for a year or two until I apply to some colleges or maybe go get a PhD. And now I'm finishing my 15th year at the same school. So yeah, maybe a little bit.
yeah. It felt very relatable to me. I was like, yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I felt when I was adjuncting too.
yeah,
Can we talk a little bit about Lone Pine? Because I love the
sure.
town and it's full of like really, really great characters.
Yeah.
Especially I love the two sort of like romantic interests, because there's like a little fun like romance plot brewing too. Um,
Hmm.
I'd love for you to talk about like how for you like character and world building relate. Like, do
Hmm.
you said that you wrote stories without so much concern for world building up front, but
Yeah,
there is like a lot of really great world building here.
thank you.
Like that, you're welcome. And like, yeah, how do they work together for you? Like, do you like let the characters you build sort of inform then the world that you build around
Yeah,
them? Mm.
absolutely. For me, I've learned my approach and what works for me is character first all the time. Once I have the characters, then I'll figure out the story. And so as soon as I figured out Ailish really fast, and then I just started kind of populating my own time with interesting people, with Russ and Marty and Otto and Elmo, and their niece that they're raising. And I also, most of these people are recovering from a war that they were part of, right? And they're trying to resettle an area that was ravaged by that. And So it's always people first, always characters first for me. And I believe very strongly that you should only see the world building that you need to see in order to understand the story. Like, I don't need 30 pages of chronology and discussing of magic rules and stuff. And I love that it exists for people that like it. And when I'm playing D&D or another RPG, like, I will definitely sit down and read all that in a book. When I'm reading a novel or a story, like, I just want to be with these people. And so, yeah, world building was a lot of it were just words that came out, like the fact that there's three nations and they're jointly ruled by this sort of proto parliament made up of rich families and three kings. I just wrote down tri-crowns and estates house. I'm like, what do those mean? I don't know. I'll figure it out later. You know?
Mm. I like that, because I think, we usually talk about world building with fantasy, but like every genre has world building, right?
Yeah,
Because you have to build a
absolutely.
world for characters to exist in. And, like when you read a contemporary fiction, it's not like, well, before we know about this marriage, like I need to know how currency works in this world.
Right.
And so like you only get the bits of it that you need for the story.
Yeah.
And I think that's really reflected in the magic too, like because you see the bits of magic that are relevant to the story while suggesting like a much wider system that like we're not seeing. Have
Yeah.
you like filled out that magic system? Like are there parts that you have built that we have not seen yet, or are you kind of like building it as you go?
I'm definitely building as I go, but there's also parts you haven't seen because I've written books 2 and 3. And so, but you're going to see like a diviner in action, you're going to see invokers in action, that kind of stuff. And I trying to break those categories out at least a little bit of where they typically are in fantasy, right? I think you can see that with Ailish and necromancy, that she explicitly does not use it to animate the dead. It's much more modern medicine, but done with magic. She's a surgeon, she's a physician, and that was just, I knew I didn't want to have her, raising the dead or animating the dead. She would hate if you called it raising the dead. She'd be so angry, and she would be at such pains to explain to you why that's not what it is. Um, but that I initially kind of conceived it more investigative, like talking to spirits, who murdered you, like, wizardly CSI kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And then as I was writing it, I was like, if she just knows all this stuff about like the body, then why couldn't she be a physician? Why couldn't she be a doctor? And so there's more parts of it, but I am definitely a make it up as I go along. When I was writing the third book, I had an outline. I really did try. And Ailish just kept doing whatever she wanted. Didn't matter what outline I had written. I'd look up and realize I was 30 pages off the outline. I think, well, I'm not going to bother trying to get back. I'll just finish the draft and then see what I got to fix.
That's great. That's like I think a really a sign of like great character building too, because like eventually, yeah, the characters do tell you what you what
Yeah.
they want to do. I really like the role of the warden too, because you're right, she is like fulfills this sort of like medical caretaker role in some respects,
Mm-hmm.
but she's also kind of like a sheriff, a little
Yeah.
bit. She's
Yeah.
protecting the town, and it is a frontier town. There are some very like westerny, feely type elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, can you talk about what exactly it is she faces, because eventually things start to kind of like go wrong in this town without giving too much away, obviously.
Sure.
And how you balance, because the story has very like high stakes in some regards, because like fantasy kind of does with like evil
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. But also it's very personal, and so how do you balance like very personal character stakes with this sort of like the epic stakes as it were?
Um, I think, how do I balance that? I think maybe it comes from my process. Like I said earlier, it's always character first for me. When I have the characters, I have the story. And so I guess part of it is when I don't know what's going to happen next, I make two characters sit down and talk. So that means I wind up cutting out a lot of dialogue. But when I'm in the space of writing a book, when I know it's going well because I am thinking like the character, and like you can ask me any question, what does Ailish think about X? And like I will have an answer in her voice. And so I can put them into the place where like when the high stakes take over, I know I know what they're gonna do. I know how they're gonna act. In the moment of crisis. But I got there because I spent so much time in their head. Just having them go through the motions of daily life. And I think some of this comes back to I used to do a lot of online text only role playing when I was in college, in various Star Wars and fantasy themed games. And sometimes there were moments of crisis. There were big plots where you're fighting dragons or fighting Imperials, whatever. But most of the time, you just went to the bar, right? You just and you role played what your character was, what they were drinking, and how they were acting that day. And I really think the way too many hours I spent doing that and so-called mushes, multi-user shared hallucinations or multi-user dungeons, I think has really informed my writing style, because a lot of times I don't know what's going to happen, so I'll just make characters talk, or when Ailish is on her own, like she reads, she gets out a book and reads. And so because I spend so much time with them, it doesn't feel difficult for whatever the situation is. I know how she's going to react. I know what she's going to do.
A really interesting thing about I guess serial storytelling about characters like this that's very character driven, because this is a first in a series, as you said. How do I put this? When you're starting out, I wonder if it kind of feels this way to you. I used to write a serial comic way back in the day. At first, when you're writing, you're kind of using the situations, to figure out who your characters are. And then at some point, the characters become so real that they their characters start to suggest the plot rather than the other way around. Does that make sense? Is that
absolutely?
Yeah, that's a really great way, I think, to get to get to know a character, and make them really real. Is that part of your process?
Yeah, definitely. I had some basics of the plot with the Warden. I knew that there were things going on beyond the frontier. I knew that there was going to be a magic item of some kind that was going to make brother turn against brother unexpectedly, and that was going to be the crux of what Ailish investigated. But in terms of it tying into what it winds up tying into and the way all the various threads coalesce, that just happened. That as Ailish is kind of going around and stamping out one fire at a time, and then slowly they accrete into something a lot bigger, that hopefully if people go back and read the book again, maybe it'll be a little more obvious that something that happens near the beginning, and then she doesn't think about it again at all until it is way later than she should be thinking about it. And I don't want to spoil it, but hopefully that works. I know some people are just too genre savvy and you can never put one over on them. And I'm not super interested in trying to make every book have a massive twist. I'm not trying to be M. Night Shyamalan or something. But hopefully the way it all comes together will sneak up on some people the way it does on Ailish.
I definitely feel that way, because when I finished it, I was that makes some things that happened early on have a lot more significance. And I think it's pretty, truthful to the way that we experience when big things happen in our lives, usually you can see them coming if you're paying attention, but we're so distracted by the minutia of our everyday lives that you just kind of see it until it's a big thing, and that feels very
absolutely.
I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the way, I guess the way the fantasy world works, in that why am I talking about it? One of the things that I think you innovate from Tolkien really interestingly is, as much as I love Tolkien, things are a lot more black and white morally, in
sure.
Orcs are bad and humans are generally good. And, it's not so simple here. People are people, regardless of what race or, species they are or anything like that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, like is it different, writing fantasy with these sort of like realistic gray relativistic areas that like have you written the more traditional kind like with the sort of like good and evil and then like there's evil here but there's also
Yeah,
like just people messing around and trying to
yeah.
figure out what's the best thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have my first trilogy. There is sort of much more clear good and evil, but the good and evil is not like racially based in any way, right? The evil is based on like pursuit of power. And that's kind of in that first trilogy, that's like the people who reject power are like the superheroes, and the people who seek it out are evil. Or who get power but don't really want it or weren't looking for it. And then in this, the big war with the orcs, like for Tolkien, this is a, you know, it's competing moral systems, right? And this, it's competing cultures. Like the orcs are like fantasy Vikings, right? They're the seeking better land, and they're trying to migrate from like this frozen archipelago where it's really hard to farm. And hopefully, I feel like I may have been too subtle with fantasy Vikings, because I've had a lot of people be like, I really didn't see that. I'm like, they have ships, and like they were coastal raiders, and then they decided to invade, and they wear like amber and ivory decorations, and they're like, oh yeah, I guess it makes sense once you say all that, and they have like bear warrior berserkers that I don't want to say too much more about, but they exist. And it's just, there aren't like good and evil like forces at work in the world. I mean, they are, but they're people, and they're people making decisions,
Mhm.
right? And the hopefully the consistent thread of what is evil in this world and these books are people who are trying to accrete more power when they already have a lot. And in particular, it's about like perverting the natural order of death, right?
Mm.
That's why Ailish is a necromancer, right? She is a servant of Anima, the silent goddess, the goddess of death, but like death is a natural part of life. You can't subvert that order, and when you do, bad things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen as a result of it.
Mhm. So this novel in many ways feels like I guess like in comic book terms like issue 0, or like in television terms like the pilot.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
like could you tell us a little bit without, I know that you are limited in what you can talk about when it comes to
Sure.
feature books, but can you tell us a little bit about maybe what's in store for our Warden and how you plan on like expanding the story, like what we can
Sure. Well, in book two, if you finish book one, like what's coming in book two. She did the most Ailish thing possible, which was like go face first into danger and create a much more dangerous situation in the process that now she has to deal with. And there's some setup in book one where she's reading her book of Aldim's, like advanced necromancy, which is like her favorite textbook. And it's talking about how he's writing at a time when necromancers still did animate the dead. That was their main thing. That's what they call the first art, and they did it constantly for everything. And it's a fairly recent development that they don't. But here he is, like 200 or 300 years ago, writing in this book that what we're doing is so dangerous and so bad that I can foresee the fact that we are going to need a different kind of necromancer who is a necrobane, whose like powers are turned to destroying the things that we create. So I'd say that's where book two is.
cool.
Yeah.
That did remind me of another thing that I love about the magic system, which is that it is also, I feel like, you know, it's not like there's dark magic and like light
Yeah.
magic so much. It's like more like tech, and you can use
Yeah.
it for good things or for bad things. And I think that's a really interesting way to, I think, and a more interesting way. Like it's really interesting when the magic kind of comes hard for the characters, when it's not like an innate, ability, like
Mhm.
it's something that they actually have to work toward. And I think like the book kind of like shows the like how would you refer to it? I guess like the lived experience of like practicing it, like from Eilish's standpoint. Very
Yeah.
cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I like an art and science approach to magic. That it's I don't love the incredibly hard magic systems with like, and I do if I'm playing a game because I want the game rules to make sense and be consistent. But when I'm reading fiction, like I'm kind of not fully on board with the total gamification. of magic in fantasy fiction, and sometimes it really gets to me. And I'm not knocking any particular writers. Like, I still read it sometimes, but it's just not what I want to write. If it has consistent rules that it always follows, it's not magic, right? Magic is about breaking rules. That's the whole point. And yeah, it's not everybody can learn to do it, but like, if you can, you will. You can learn, the opportunity is there. But of course, there's issues of like privilege and class and like the availability of that education that touches on a little bit in this book, and is going to be, you see more of that in book 3, which I don't think I can say too much about. And hopefully in my wild, I would really like to write. I have this whole book idea that is set in this world that doesn't have Alish in it, that would follow a kind of group of characters who are people who couldn't hack it, who got kicked out of the Lyceum for one reason or another, or failed out, or weren't powerful enough to go there, or didn't have the money to go there. That I would really like to write someday, and like super explore that part of the world that I created.
Wow. I hope
yeah, so here's hoping.
Wow. Well, I hope, you'll consider coming back to the show to talk about the next.
Absolutely.
I loved this one. I can't wait to read the next.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Listeners, please check out The Warden. It came out this past Tuesday for us, but by the time you hear this, it will be, out in the world for a bit. So please pick it up from your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like your books. Thanks for joining us. And it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.